Low clouds pressed over eastern England, and the airfield at RAF Kimbolton smelled of wet grass, fuel, and the metallic breath of engines warming for another journey toward Germany. Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood beneath the tail of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress known to its crew as Lucky Bell, staring at the narrow plexiglass enclosure that would soon swallow him for the next 6 hours. He was 24, lean in the shoulders, with a long, angular face that had not yet learned how to hide fatigue. His brown hair was clipped close under a fleece-lined flight helmet, and a faint, stubborn stubble shadowed his jaw despite the early shave. The olive-drab heated flight suit hung slightly loose on him, the wires for the electrical lining coiling like quiet veins toward the socket near his waist. He looked younger when he was silent, and older when he spoke. Mercer had flown 9 missions. On his 6th, he watched the B-17 off their right wing take a direct strike to the tail. He remembered the way the plexiglass had blossomed outward like shattered ice, and how no return fire ever came from that position. 8 parachutes opened in the sky. The 9th never appeared. Since then, he had begun to distrust anything that sounded too confident when spoken in a briefing room. Lieutenant Howard Pierce, the pilot of Lucky Bell, climbed down from the cockpit ladder and lit a cigarette with hands that trembled just slightly from cold rather than nerves. Pierce was 30, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair and a calm, almost rural steadiness in his eyes. His sheepskin A2 jacket creaked when he moved. He nodded once at Mercer. "Kassel today," he said quietly. "Long one." Behind him, Technical Sergeant Wilkes, the waist gunner, adjusted his parachute straps and grinned in a way that tried to pass for cheerfulness. Wilkes had a round face, pale freckles, and the habit of talking too much when afraid. "Heard the Krauts like to come in from 6 o'clock, he said, jerking a thumb toward the tail. "Good thing you're back there, Danny." Mercer managed a thin smile. He had heard that same sentence many times. It never sounded like comfort. He climbed into the tail compartment before engine start, folding himself into the narrow bicycle seat arrangement, testing the traverse of the twin Browning .50 caliber machine guns. The metal was already cold through his gloves. He checked the ammunition belts, 400 rounds per gun, running the links through his fingers with a quiet, ritual focus. Outside, the 4 Wright Cyclone engines coughed into life one by one, sending vibration down the length of the aluminum fuselage until the entire aircraft felt like a living thing shuddering awake. As the B-17 taxied, Mercer watched the gray runway slide past through curved glass. He tried not to think of how small this compartment really was. 4 feet wide, barely enough room to shift his knees. 40 feet of aircraft separated him from the rest of the crew. If something went wrong back here, no one would reach him in time. He had memorized the doctrine at gunnery school. Wait. Conserve ammunition, fire only when the fighter is close enough to guarantee hits. The instructors had spoken in measured tones about discipline and efficiency, about mathematics and probability, but the sky over Germany did not behave like a classroom. German fighters did not politely wait to be shot at. He remembered the gun camera footage shown after that 6th mission. The enemy aircraft had opened fire from far beyond the distance Americans were trained to use. Cannon shells had already been tearing through the tail before the gunner ever touched his triggers. That memory sat with him now, like a stone in his chest. The B-17 lifted from the runway with a heavy, patient grace. Through the rear glass, Mercer watched RAF Kimbolton shrink into a patchwork of green and brown fields fading into mist. The English coast slipped away beneath them, white cliffs dissolving into gray water. Ahead lay occupied France, Belgium, and finally Germany. Over the intercom, Pierce's voice came calm and level. "Climb to 25,000, form up." Mercer flexed his fingers inside his gloves and leaned forward into the gun sight. At altitude, the temperature outside would fall towards 60 degrees below zero. The heated suit hummed faintly against his body, a quiet reminder that survival up here depended as much on wires and plugs as on courage. He knew what would happen once the fighter escort turned back. He knew the sky behind them would begin to fill with distant shapes growing steadily larger. He also knew he would have to make a choice that no manual had clearly prepared him for. Whether to obey the rule that said, "Wait," or trust the uneasy conviction that waiting might be the very thing that killed him. For now, there was only the steady drone of engines and the long, empty sky stretching behind Lucky Bell. Mercer, watched that emptiness carefully because he understood something that could not be written in any handbook. In this war, the most dangerous place was not where the enemy already was, but where he would appear next. By the time Lucky Bell crossed the Belgian coast, the world behind Daniel Mercer was no longer empty. The gray sky he had watched so carefully in the tail compartment had begun to change texture, as if distant specks were being stitched into the fabric of the air itself. At first, they looked like imperfections in the glass. Then they grew, dark and deliberate, moving with purpose against the steady formation of bombers. Over the intercom, Lieutenant Pierce's voice came tight but controlled. Escort turning back. Mercer did not need to be told what that meant. He had been waiting for this moment since takeoff. The faint comfort of the P-47s circling nearby disappeared with a casual waggle of wings, and the bomber stream pressed forward alone toward Germany. The engines droned with the same patient rhythm as before, but now every vibration felt like a countdown. He leaned into the gun sight. His long fingers flexed around the twin grips of the Browning .5s. His breath fogged, faintly inside the mask, before the heated suit pushed warmth back into him. His jaw was set in a way that made his face look older than 24. The memory of the shattered tail from his 6th mission returned uninvited, the silent gunner, the absent parachute, and with it came the realization that this was the exact geometry in which that man had died. The first fighters approached from high 6 o'clock, descending with quiet precision. Mercer recognized the broad wings and compact nose profile of the Focke-Wulf before he consciously named it. It came in steady, nose pointed directly at him, not weaving, not afraid. It was the kind of attack gunnery school had described in diagrams drawn on blackboards, the enemy growing larger in a straight line, while the gunner waited for the correct distance. He did not wait. At nearly 800 yards, Mercer squeezed both triggers. The Brownings roared to life, the vibration traveling through his arms and into his ribs. Tracer. Rounds streaked backward in bright, deliberate lines that at first fell short, slipping under the approaching fighter like thrown pebbles. He adjusted by instinct, walking the stream upward. The German pilot saw it. Even at that distance, Mercer could tell by the sudden, sharp roll of the aircraft that the man had been forced to react. The FW-190 broke hard to the right, abandoning the clean, stable path it had intended to use. It did not fire. Mercer's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. He released the triggers and immediately searched for the next shape in the sky. A second fighter was already angling in from lower 6 o'clock, trying to slip beneath his field of fire. This time Mercer depressed the guns almost to their limit and fired again. Shorter bursts, guiding the tracers across the nose of the incoming aircraft. The pilot pulled up prematurely, releasing cannon shells into empty sky far above Lucky Bell. Inside the bomber, Wilkes's voice crackled over. The intercom, nervous and high. "They're all over us back here." "I see them," Mercer muttered, though no one could hear him. The attacks multiplied. Shapes appeared from both high and low 6, some diving steeply, others climbing into the formation. Mercer fired, paused, corrected, fired again. He was no longer thinking about distance in yards. He was thinking in seconds, how long the German pilot could remain on a straight path before being forced to move. Every time he saw a fighter twitch away early, he felt a strange, grim satisfaction that had nothing to do with killing and everything to do with survival. A burst of cannon fire flashed past his right side, so close he felt the concussion through the plexiglass. The tail shuddered. For a fraction of a second, a cold spike of fear went through him, sharp and electric. He expected the glass to explode inward. It did not. He kept firing. Sweat gathered under his helmet despite the freezing air outside. His gloved fingers were beginning to ache from the constant pressure on the triggers. Ammunition counters in his mind ticked down rapidly. He knew he was using far more than the instructors would ever approve of. He also knew, with a clarity that frightened him, that if he stopped now and waited for a prettier shot, someone in this airplane might pay for that discipline with his life. Another fighter came in straight, bold, almost arrogant. Mercer centered it in his sight and held the triggers longer this time. Tracers connected visibly along the engine cowling. The aircraft lurched, smoke trailing behind, as it veered away in a shallow dive. Mercer did not watch to see if it fell. He had already turned to find the next threat. Time dissolved into a sequence of flashes, vibrations, and fleeting silhouettes. The sky behind Lucky Bell was no longer an empty place to fear, but a crowded place to manage. Mercer understood now that he was not fighting for victory. He was fighting for rhythm, for the fragile balance that kept German pilots from settling into the calm, lethal posture they preferred. When the intercom announced they were nearing the target area, Mercer realized his arms were trembling. He had no clear memory of how many bursts he had fired, or how many fighters he had turned aside. He only knew that the tail of Lucky Bell was still intact, and he was still alive inside it. For the first time since takeoff, he allowed himself a single, quiet thought. Perhaps the rule he had broken was the only reason they were still in the sky. The two aircraft held their impossible formation through a torn corridor of gray air, the wounded P-47 shivering on sheer will and engine grit, the FW-190 beside it like a blade that had decided, for reasons unknown, not to fall. Robert S. Johnson's breath came thin and harsh through the wind that poured into his cockpit. He was still 22, still lean and sharp-featured under the leather flight helmet, with brown stubble roughening his jaw and raw, reddened eyes that refused to blink for long. His olive-drab flight suit was stiff with sweat and cold. The parachute harness cut into his shoulders. The Mae West vest rose and fell against his ribs, as if it too were trying to keep him alive. His hands, cramped inside worn gloves, trembled not from fear alone, but from the strain of holding a crippled machine steady while the sky tried to shake it apart. For a second, he thought this was some new kind of cruelty, an enemy drawing close to watch the final moment from the best seat. Johnson had seen pilots behave like that. He had heard the laughter in mess halls, the rough jokes about targets that had nowhere left to go. War did strange things to men. It took the soft edges off their souls and replaced them with habits. Yet the German fighters' guns remained silent. No muzzle flash, no tracers. Only the roar of engines and the frantic whistle of air through broken plexiglass. Johnson forced himself to look sideways. Through the canopy's jagged frame, he could see the other cockpit clearly now. The German pilot sat upright, close enough that Johnson could make out the pale oval of a face behind goggles, the dark line of a scarf at the throat, and the squared shoulders of a man who had flown long enough to carry fatigue like a second uniform. The pilot's leather jacket fit close, practical rather than theatrical, and his posture held the calm of someone used to deciding life and death at speed. Johnson did not know his name. In that moment, the man was simply the enemy made human, breathing, watching, choosing. A strange memory flickered through Johnson's mind. A briefing back in England, the smell of damp wool coats and cigarette smoke, a senior officer drawing lines on a map and speaking in a voice drained of warmth. "Do not assume mercy," the officer had said, as if describing weather. "Assume competence." Johnson had listened and believed. He believed it now, too, and that was why this quiet felt more dangerous than gunfire. Quiet in war often meant a trap. His right shoulder throbbed, a deep ache from where the harness had bitten him during the jolts, and his fingers felt numb in the cold. He checked his gauges again, partly from habit, partly to avoid staring too long at the man beside him. The panel was a damaged constellation, some lights dead, others flickering weakly. The engine temperature needle hovered in a place that made his stomach tighten. Every instinct urged him to dive away, to break formation, to do something, but there was nowhere to go. His aircraft was too damaged for a violent maneuver. He was not flying a fighter anymore. He was steering a wounded beast that could collapse if startled. He realized, with a kind of hollow clarity, that his choice had narrowed to two primitive things. Keep the wings level, keep breathing. Then the German pilot moved. Johnson's muscles tightened, waiting for the sudden snap of gunfire. Instead, the man raised a gloved hand, slow and deliberate, not reaching for a trigger, but lifting it toward his helmet in a crisp gesture that could only be one thing: a salute. Not flamboyant, not mocking, a small, restrained motion that carried more weight than any shouted word across a battlefield. Johnson's mind refused to accept it at first. Salutes belonged to parade grounds, to graduation ceremonies, to men who still believed the world had order. They did not belong here, in the freezing air above occupied France, alongside an American aircraft riddled with holes, a pilot who could barely keep his machine from falling into the earth. Yet the gesture hung there, undeniable. Johnson's throat tightened. He felt something shift inside him that he could not name, part disbelief, part shame, part gratitude, and part terror that gratitude itself might be a betrayal of his own. He had been taught to think of the enemy as a single dark mass, faceless and interchangeable. The war required that simplification. It made killing possible. But now there was a face. Now there was a hand that had chosen not to kill. He thought of his lost friend over the channel again. The sudden disappearance, the emptiness left behind. That friend had never been offered a pause. Johnson had never been offered a pause until this second. The injustice of it struck him like a physical blow. Why him? Why now? What unseen math of war had placed mercy in the path of one man and not another? The German pilot held the salute only a heartbeat longer, then lowered his hand. His fighter eased back slightly, still close enough that Johnson could see the tilt of his head, as if the man were making sure Johnson understood what had happened. Johnson did not know the rules in the German pilot's mind, whether he was obeying some private code, whether he was haunted by a brother lost to the war, whether faith or fatigue had finally outweighed ambition. He could only feel the gravity of the decision hovering between them like a third aircraft, invisible and immense. The FW-190 began to drift away. Its wing dipped, not in attack, but in departure. The German pilot turned with controlled grace, the aircraft carving a clean arc into the gray. In a few seconds, the fighter had become a smaller shape, then a shadow, then a memory dissolving into cloud. Johnson's cockpit felt suddenly louder without the German beside him. Louder because the silence had been replaced by the brutal truth of survival. The wind still screamed through the broken canopy. The thunderbolt still shook. The damage was still there, every hole a mouth that could swallow him if the engine faltered. Mercy had not repaired anything. It had only removed one threat from the long list of things that could end him. He looked forward again, eyes stinging. Somewhere ahead lay the thin strip of water that separated him from home. Somewhere behind lay the battlefield that had tried to claim him. He did not feel victorious. He felt chosen by accident and burdened by the knowledge that a stranger's decision had become part of his life. Johnson swallowed, tasting oil and blood, and pressed the nose of the P-47 gently toward the west. His hands steadied on the controls, not because the fear was gone, but because responsibility had returned to its harsh, familiar place. The German pilot had given him something that war rarely allowed, a chance. Now Johnson had to earn it, second by second, without anyone beside him, with only the wounded Thunderbolt and the cold, indifferent sky. He did not speak aloud this time. He simply flew, carrying the weight of that raised hand as if it were a medal made of silence. The turn west came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if Lucky Bell itself needed time to believe it had survived the target. Daniel Mercer felt the change in direction, not through sight, but through the subtle shift of weight against his shoulder and the altered hum of the engines. Kassel disappeared behind them into cloud and smoke, and for a brief, dangerous moment, the sky at 6 o'clock was empty. His left arm throbbed with a deep, pulsing heat that seemed out of place in the frozen air. Blood had soaked into the sleeve of his heated suit and begun to stiffen where the cold reached it. He tightened his jaw and wedged his injured arm against his body to keep it from moving. The remaining Browning felt heavier now, less like a weapon and more like a responsibility that had to be held up by will alone. Over the intercom, voices overlapped. Damage reports, fuel checks, altitude corrections. Lieutenant Pierce's tone remained steady, but Mercer could hear the strain beneath it. Somewhere in the formation, engines were failing. Somewhere, a crew was deciding whether they could make the channel or not. Then the specs returned. They did not come in the wild rush of before. These fighters approached more cautiously, spreading out, testing angles, as if aware that the bombers were wounded but still dangerous. Mercer saw two shapes form up far behind them, small and deliberate against the gray. He leaned into the sight, ignoring the ache in his neck and shoulders. His ammunition was no longer abundant. He had not counted rounds, but he knew from the weight of the belts and the silence of the jammed gun that what remained would have to last for the rest of the journey across hostile sky. The luxury of long, warning bursts was gone. Every squeeze of the trigger would have to be chosen. The first fighter made a shallow approach from low 6, weaving slightly, trying to force Mercer into wasting fire. He waited. The instinct to shoot early pressed hard against his nerves, but he forced himself to hold until the aircraft committed to a line. When it did, he fired a tight, measured burst. The tracers struck close enough to the nose that the pilot immediately rolled away, abandoning the pass without firing. Mercer exhaled slowly. His hand was trembling. He steadied it against the metal housing of the gun mount, feeling the cold bite through his glove. Another fighter came from high 6, diving faster, trying to shorten the window of exposure. Mercer tracked it carefully, letting it grow in the sight until he was certain of the path. He fired again, shorter this time, just enough to force the pilot to brake early. The German aircraft snapped upward, cannon fire spilling harmlessly into the air behind the formation. He understood now that he was no longer trying to dominate the sky. He was rationing his presence in it, making each appearance of tracer light count as a warning rather than a wall. A new voice cut through the intercom, unfamiliar and strained. "Bell, this is Red Leader 3. We're losing altitude. Engine's gone." Mercer did not know the face attached to that voice, but he pictured the man anyway. Oxygen mask tight across a young face, gloved hands gripping controls that no longer obeyed properly. He wanted to turn and look, to see the crippled bomber falling away, but he kept his eyes locked behind him. If he looked, he might miss the next attack. The fighters sensed weakness in the formation and pressed closer. Mercer fired twice more in careful, deliberate bursts, each one buying a few more seconds for Lucky Bell and the aircraft around it. His injured arm had gone numb, hanging uselessly, but the rest of his body had become strangely calm. The panic from earlier had burned away, leaving only a narrow, focused awareness of distance, angle, and timing. At last, the shapes behind them began to thin. The Belgian coastline appeared faintly through breaks in the cloud, a gray line that meant the limit of German range. The fighters turned back one by one, shrinking into the distance the same way they had first appeared. Mercer kept watching long after they were gone. He did not trust emptiness anymore. When Pierce's voice finally came over the intercom again, "Channel in sight," Mercer realized how deeply tired he was. The adrenaline that had held him upright drained away, leaving his muscles weak and heavy. The Browning sagged in his grip, and he had to consciously lower it back into its resting position. He leaned his head against the cold plexiglass and closed his eyes for just a moment. The tail of Lucky Bell was scarred, cracked, and stained with his blood, but it was still there. So was he. And the long gray water of the channel was sliding beneath them, carrying them, slowly and improbably, toward home. The English coastline appeared not as a triumphant sight, but as a pale, uncertain line through the haze, and Daniel Mercer kept watching the sky behind Lucky Bell long after the last German fighter had vanished. He had learned not to trust quiet. Quiet in this war often meant something had simply not happened yet. The channel slipped beneath them in a slow gray expanse. The vibration of the engines, constant for hours, now felt strangely distant to him, as if he were hearing it from inside a metal box rather than sitting at the tail of it. His right hand still rested on the grip of the surviving Browning, though he had no memory of deciding to keep it there. His left arm hung stiff and dark with dried blood. The heated suit hummed faintly, but he felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "Approaching Kimbolton," Pierce's voice came over the intercom, softer now, fatigue bleeding through the discipline. Mercer tried to answer but found his throat dry and uncooperative. He swallowed and forced a reply. "Tails, still here." A faint chuckle crackled back through the wire. It sounded older than the pilot himself. The landing was rougher than usual. Mercer felt the wheels strike the runway through the entire length of the fuselage, a shudder that traveled into his bones. The engines throttled down gradually, and with them came a silence that felt almost unnatural after so many hours of noise. For the first time since takeoff, he became aware of his own breathing. He waited for someone to come for him. When the tail hatch finally opened, cold air rushed in, sharper and wetter than the air at altitude. 2 ground crewmen climbed up into the narrow space. One of them was a young corporal with a narrow face, pale eyes, and hands already stained with oil and grease. His name tag read, H. Collins. He stopped short when he saw the blood on Mercer's sleeve. "Jesus," Collins muttered quietly, then caught himself. "Easy, Sergeant. We've got you." They helped Mercer out of the compartment slowly. As he unfolded himself from the cramped seat, pain surged through his left side so violently that his vision blurred. He realized how long he had been ignoring it. His boots touched the runway, and for a moment his knees nearly gave way. The ground felt unfamiliar, unstable, as if it might tilt without warning. He looked back at Lucky Bell. The tail section was scarred with holes, the plexiglass crazed with fractures like frozen spider webs. Dark streaks marked where cannon fragments had torn through aluminum. It looked less like an aircraft, and more like something that had survived a storm at sea. Lieutenant Pierce stood nearby, helmet off now, sandy hair flattened with sweat. His broad face had lost its usual steadiness. He met Mercer's eyes and gave a single nod. No words passed between them. None were needed. A medical jeep arrived quickly, driven by a young Army nurse with cropped brown hair tucked under a wool cap. Her name was Lieutenant Margaret Hale, and she moved with a calm efficiency that suggested she had seen too much of this already. Her uniform was neat despite the mud. Her sleeves rolled back as she examined Mercer's arm. "You're lucky," she said quietly, probing the wound with gloved fingers. Fragments missed the bone. Mercer nodded but barely heard her. His eyes had drifted past her shoulder toward the far end of the runway where other B-17's were landing, some missing panels, some trailing smoke, some not landing at all. A truck drove by, carrying stretchers. Mercer looked away before he could see who was on them. Hale wrapped his arm tightly and motioned for him to sit on the edge of the jeep. As she worked, Mercer found his gaze returning again and again to the tail of Lucky Bell. He replayed the moments of the fight in his mind, not as memories of sound and motion, but as distances. 800 yards, 600, 400. The places where he had chosen to fire, and the places where he had chosen to wait. He realized something that unsettled him deeply. He no longer remembered the faces of the German pilots. He remembered only the geometry of their approach, the angles they had taken, the way their aircraft had grown larger in his sight. War, he understood now, had a way of reducing men to shapes in the sky. Wilkes approached slowly, helmet dangling from one hand, freckles pale against a face gone gray with exhaustion. "You kept them off us," he said, voice low. "I don't know how, but you did." Mercer looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I just didn't wait." Wilkes frowned, not fully understanding, but nodded anyway. As the jeep started toward the medical station, Mercer felt the weight of the day settle into him. Not triumph, not relief, only a heavy awareness that the choice he had made up there, when to fire, when not to, had mattered more than anything he had ever done in his life. And that, tomorrow, if they flew again, he would have to make that choice all over. Daniel Mercer did not remember walking into the debriefing hut. One moment he had been sitting on the edge of the medical jeep with his arm wrapped tight in white gauze. The next, he was inside a low wooden building that smelled of damp paper, coffee, and wet wool. The war had followed him in. It hung in the air with the same heaviness as the fog outside. A single stove ticked in the corner, doing little to push back the chill. Around a long table sat men in flight jackets and oxygen-stained scarves, their faces gray with fatigue. Some stared down at mugs they had not touched. Others watched the door, as if expecting someone else to walk in, someone who would not. Lieutenant Howard Pierce sat near the end of the table, shoulders rounded now, hands clasped together in a way Mercer had never seen in the cockpit. Wilkes leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused, lips moving silently as if he were replaying the mission frame by frame. No one spoke loudly, even voices seemed to understand. They had no right to disturb the room. At the head of the table stood Captain Robert Ellery, the intelligence officer. He was in his mid-30s, tall and thin, with dark hair combed precisely to one side and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light when he turned his head. His uniform was immaculate despite the long day, a habit of a man who believed order on the outside might help him manage the chaos he collected from the crews. In front of him lay a map of Germany dotted with pencil marks and small notes. Ellery looked up as Mercer entered. His gaze moved briefly to the bandaged arm, then to Mercer's face. "Take a seat, Sergeant." Mercer sat slowly. The wooden chair felt harder than the bicycle seat in the tail. He rested his injured arm on the table and kept his eyes on the grain of the wood. Ellery began asking questions in a voice that was calm but searching. Time of first fighter contact, direction of approach, estimated range when you opened fire. The questions were clinical, almost polite. They were not about fear or noise or the smell of cordite inside the tail compartment. They were about distances, angles, timing. Mercer found himself answering in the same language he had been thinking in since the sky over Belgium. "High 6, around 800 yards, he said quietly. Several heads lifted at that. Ellery's pencil paused above the paper. 800? Yes, sir. A murmur passed along the table. Someone shifted in his chair. Wilkes looked over at Mercer with something like surprise, as if hearing the numbers for the first time made the day feel different. Ellery did not react immediately. He wrote something down, then continued. "And you continued engaging at that range?" "Yes, sir, when they committed to a line." Ellery nodded slowly. "Did you observe any change in their attack behavior?" Mercer thought about the way the fighters had begun to roll away sooner, how their passes had become shorter, more cautious. He remembered the sensation that he was not fighting to destroy them, but to make them uncomfortable. "They didn't hold their course as long," he said. "They had to move sooner." Ellery's pencil moved again. The scratching sound seemed unusually loud in the room. Around the table, other crewmen began adding their own fragments. A waist gunner from another aircraft described seeing fighters break off earlier than expected. A radio operator mentioned that fewer cannon shells had reached their fuselage than on previous missions. The pattern was not dramatic, not heroic. It was subtle, statistical, the kind of thing only noticed after survival. Mercer listened, a strange feeling forming in his chest. The decisions he had made alone in that narrow compartment were now being translated into notes on a page, reduced to observations, converted into something that might be passed along to another crew. He was not sure how he felt about that. Ellery finally looked up, again. "Sergeant Mercer, why did you open fire that early?" The room grew very quiet. Mercer stared at the table for a long moment before answering. He thought of the shattered tale from his 6th mission, of the gunner who had never fired a shot, of the empty parachute space in the sky. "Because waiting didn't seem to be working," he said simply. No one laughed, no one argued. Ellery nodded once slowly and closed his notebook. "That will be all for now." As the men rose and drifted toward the door, Mercer remained seated for a moment longer. He understood something that unsettled him more than the battle itself. What he had done out of instinct and fear might become instruction for someone else. A line in a briefing, a suggestion passed quietly from instructor to student. Outside, the fog had thickened. The airfield lights glowed faintly in the mist. Mercer stepped out into the cold, feeling the weight of the day settle deeper into him. He had survived Kassel. He had kept the tale of Lucky Bell intact, and now, without meaning to, he had left something behind in that room that might outlive him. Daniel Mercer left the debrief hut and walked alone across the dim perimeter of the airfield, the fog pressing close around the lamps like damp wool. The noise of the base had settled into a distant murmur, engines being checked, tools striking metal, low voices that did not rise above what the day had already taken. His boots sank slightly into the soft earth beside the runway, and for the first time since dawn, he felt the full weight of his body rather than the machinery around it. He stopped where he could see the tail of Lucky Bell through the mist. Ground crew had already placed ladders against the fuselage. Lantern light glowed through torn aluminum where mechanics inspected damage that would be written down in numbers by morning. The aircraft looked tired, as if it too were trying to remember how to stand after what it had endured. Mercer studied the fractured plexiglass of the tail compartment from a distance. He could still picture exactly how the sky had looked through it. Hours earlier, clear, then crowded, then violent. The memory did not come back as sound or motion anymore. It returned as distance. 800 yards, 600, the places where he had chosen to act. A voice came from behind him. "Sergeant Mercer?" He turned slowly. The man approaching wore the dark blue wool of a chaplain's uniform beneath a long coat. His name patch read, Captain William Avery. He was in his early 40s, tall and slightly stooped, with iron gray hair and a face lined in a way that suggested more listening than speaking. His eyes were gentle without being naive. "I was told you might be out here," Avery said quietly. "Mind if I stand with you a moment?" Mercer shook his head. They stood side by side without speaking for a while, watching the mechanics move like shadows around the wounded bomber. "You lost friends today," Avery said after a time. It was not a question. Mercer nodded once. He did not trust his voice yet. "I've noticed something," the chaplain continued. Men who come back from days like this don't talk about fear first. They talk about decisions, the moments when they had to choose what to do. Mercer let that sit between them. The chaplain's words did not feel like comfort. They felt like recognition. "I broke the rule," Mercer said finally, staring at the tail. "Opened fire before I was supposed to." Avery glanced at him, then back at the aircraft. "And you're wondering if that was right?" "I'm wondering why it worked," Mercer replied. The chaplain smiled faintly. "War has a way of exposing which rules were written on paper and which ones were written in blood." They fell silent again. Mercer thought about the debrief, about Ellery's pencil scratching across the page, about how easily something done out of fear and instinct could become instruction for men he would never meet. The idea unsettled him. It felt like leaving a piece of himself behind in that room, something that no longer belonged entirely to him. He remembered the gunner from his 6th mission, the one who never fired. He had not known that man's name either, yet the memory of his death had guided Mercer's hands more clearly than any training manual. Perhaps that too was a kind of inheritance. Avery cleared his throat softly. "You know, Sergeant, courage doesn't always look like charging forward. Sometimes it looks like refusing to wait." Mercer let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The words did not ease the heaviness in his chest, but they arranged it into something he could carry. In the distance, a truck passed with covered shapes in the back. Mercer looked away without thinking. The war had already claimed what it wanted for the day. What remained was the quiet obligation of those who had come back. He looked once more at Lucky Bell. The tail that had held him suspended between life and death was now just metal and glass again, being measured, repaired, recorded. Tomorrow it might fly. Tomorrow he might sit in it again. But tonight he understood something clearly for the first time. The sky behind a bomber was not empty space waiting to be feared. It was a place where choices lived, small, private decisions made in seconds that could alter the fate of 10 men inside a thin shell of aluminum. Avery placed a hand briefly on Mercer's good shoulder. "Get some rest," he said gently. "You'll need it." Mercer nodded. As he walked back toward the barracks, the fog swallowed the airfield behind him. The lamps became faint halos, the aircraft disappeared into gray, and the war receded just far enough for him to feel the quiet inside his own head. He knew sleep would not come easily. He also knew that when he returned to the tail of a B-17 again, he would carry with him not just training, not just fear, but the memory of the distances at which he had chosen to act. And somewhere in that memory, he sensed, would remain the part of him that had survived Kassel. War does not soften for anyone. It bends steel, erases towns from maps, and teaches young men lessons their hearts were never meant to hold. It offers no clean justice, no neat endings, no comfort that feels earned. And yet, in the narrow space between noise and silence, something fragile sometimes survives. A scarred aircraft still able to land, a wounded hand still able to hold a trigger steady, a mind that refuses to surrender to fear, even when fear has every reason to win. Perhaps that is the only quiet grace war ever allows. Not triumph, but the choice to act before fear decides for you. In our ordinary lives, the battles no longer roar across the sky. They arrive quietly, responsibilities, doubts, losses that no one else can see. But the question remains unchanged. Do we wait for the perfect moment, or do we choose to act when it matters? If this story stayed with you, let it travel further. Share it, so the lives inside it are not reduced to silence. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice becomes part of remembering. And if you wish to continue walking through true stories of courage, loss, and the small decisions that shape survival, consider subscribing. Wars end in dates and signatures, but the human choices made inside them live on only when we choose to carry them forward.